Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Silva. Thank you for joining me for this talk on gender diversity and gender dysphoria, which, importantly, are not the same thing. In preparing for this important talk, I asked myself what it was that I wanted to say. Beyond enumerating the diagnostic criteria and elaborating on those, what else was there to say about gender and gender diversity? What unique perspective could I bring? What of my direct experience, both as a clinician and as a person? A gay person, as it turns out, and I'll share the relevance of that here in a moment. I am going to review what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders has to say about transgenderism with and without dysphoria. But I also have an important message to share about intolerance from a personal perspective. As a gay person who has certainly experienced my share of discrimination, I am absolutely not a bigot. But as it turned out, it wasn't as simple as that. It turns out that we may all have a little xenophobia within us. Xenophobia, from the Greek xenos, stranger, and phobos, fear. The stranger part is easy, although interestingly, xenos can also mean guest. But let's unpack phobos, fear. I remember my brother jeering one time, "I'm not homophobic. I'm not afraid of queers." This was in the 70s, before gay people had reclaimed that word. He was using it as a noun, and it was very offensive. But to my brother's credit, he eventually evolved past his homophobia. But phobos also means flight, which is what phobia entails: a loathing, a fleeing from, an aversion to. In this case, the other, what seems strange and foreign to us. Certainly it encompasses hate. I hate gay people, which is something you might actually have heard said aloud in 1983, 10 years after the APA admitted that homosexuality was not a mental illness. I was a teenager in the 1980s. And for those of you who don't remember or weren't born yet, let me tell you, the 80s were an extremely homophobic time. After the election of Ronald Reagan and the rise of conservatism and the so-called, quote-unquote, moral majority, the country took a hard turn towards the right, and gay people were openly and systematically demonized and relegated to the position of second-class citizens by one administration or another, from school districts to the White House. Out teenagers were extremely rare. It was nothing for my best friend in high school to say, "I think gay people don't have the right to live," to an entire classroom. This was in response to our science teacher asking the class what we thought about gay people when the subject came up somehow. She was also a coach, and in retrospect, clearly a lesbian, although I never suspected it at the time, but all she could do was nod. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody said a word, including me sitting right next to him. Nobody said, "Well, what are you talking about? They don't have a right to live. What are you, a Nazi?" We were invisible, the teacher and I, and at least one other student, female student. But none of us could risk outing ourselves. When I finally did tell my friend, he suddenly wasn't interested in being my friend anymore. And I have many other stories of discrimination. A prospective roommate backing out at the last minute my freshman year in medical school when I told him and his parents at dinner. Homosexuality came up, I was honest, and he immediately declared that he no longer wanted to share an apartment with me. His father just got up at one point and left the table without excusing himself and telling me it was nice to meet me. I didn't even notice. He was just gone at one point. His mother hung around long enough to tell me how nice the black neighbors were. They were black, but they were so nice. I know what it's like. So, I'm the last person who would deny transgendered individuals their rights. So I can't be transphobic, right? Right? And yet, stay tuned for more on that. But thankfully, things have really changed for the better. And in just a few decades, what I never thought I would see in my lifetime, everyone having an equal right to be married, even if there are still millions of people in the country who adamantly oppose it. But in 1972, homosexuality itself was considered a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association, the preeminent mental health organization in the United States then and now, and the publisher of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That organization had been lobbied for years to remove being gay from its roster of mental disease, to no avail, despite mounting evidence that gay people were no more miserable or dysfunctional or maladaptive or incapable of fostering healthy, intimate relationships, as psychiatrists had claimed for years, than the next person. The problem was that although police were no longer raiding gay bars and arresting people, homophobia was the lay of the land, and any gay psychiatrists, and they were legion, were closeted, afraid of losing their jobs and possibly their credentials if they came out. Who knows what witch hunts the Texas Medical Board, my licensing agency, would have conducted in that era. It wasn't until Dr. Anonymous, a gay psychiatrist who turned out to be Dr. John Fryer, MD, addressed the 1972 annual meeting of the APA wearing a paper bag over his head to conceal his face and identity, that the Board of Trustees finally voted to eliminate homosexuality as a disease from the second edition of the DSM the following year. I was 4 years old and suddenly no longer mentally ill, according to the experts. Exactly 20 years later, while in medical school, I was sponsored on a trip to attend the 146th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in San Francisco. And I took some really good photographs. Photographs, not pics, with an actual camera that wasn't also a phone, and film that had to be developed in a photo lab into actual paper photographs. Photographs which I kept in a box with other photos from the past. I dug them out and digitized them just for this video, and here is perhaps the most interesting one. APA Go Away. I came upon this site outside the convention center, a sandblaster on a break from removing this spray-painted protest from the trans community. You see, at that time, the DSM-3R contained diagnostic criteria for quote-unquote transsexualism, which had been added in 1980. Being trans was tantamount to being mentally ill. The next year, with the release of DSM-4, the name was changed to gender identity disorder, ostensibly to reduce stigma, but still a disorder. The DSM-5 was published in 2013, 19 years later, and it did two things. Renamed the condition once again to gender dysphoria to further destigmatize, and moved it out of the sexual disorders section into its own section. This wasn't merely a name change. Now we were saying that the pathology lay not in a person's gender identity, but in the dysphoria caused by the misalignment of that gender with their natal sex and their consequent assigned gender, which is a subtle but significant change. There are further subtleties because, as I've said, gender diversity and gender dysphoria are not the same thing, and not all trans and non-binary individuals are dysphoric. I'll say that again. Not all trans and non-binary individuals are dysphoric. I'll get into the practical applications of that, especially with regard to applying the diagnostic criteria in a moment. But first, let's go over some definitions because the terminology can get confusing. There's a lot and it's ever changing. So I'm going to start very basic here because I'm not going to assume that all viewers out there are clear on this, okay? But a trans woman is an individual whose gender identity is feminine. We say she and her, and by definition, she is trans, so her natal sex, meaning her sex at birth, was the opposite. Natal sex, by the way, is probably a better term than the still widely used quote-unquote biological sex, but it means the same thing. Now, of course, I'm not considering here the relatively rare cases of ambiguous sex at birth, when a baby's sex has to be determined, usually by chromosomal analysis, and or assigned, as when the parents decide what medical interventions to consent to, and whether they'll raise the child as a boy or a girl. Those are called intersex conditions, formerly hermaphroditism. And it can be noted here that the I in LGBTQIA stands for intersex. The A stands for asexual. A trans man is a person who identifies as a male. We call him he, and we speak of his natal sex being the opposite. So there are a lot of people out there who are still unclear about that. The opposites are, of course, cis men and women. Those individuals who happen to be in the vast majority, whose gender identity matches their assigned gender at birth, which further correlates with their natal sex. These people are cisgender or alternately non-transgender. By the way, it's okay to refer to someone as trans. Trans individuals refer to themselves as being trans. It's not offensive, in case you were wondering. Anything else I would stay away from. We used to describe these individuals as transsexual, as being transsexuals, both adjective and noun. But those terms have fallen out of favor. I think the term sex can be confusing because while it refers to a person's biological sex in terms of male or female, sex can also mean the sexual act. And so when you say transsexual, there can be a sexual connotation that it's just confusing. I include them here in this section on terminology for the sake of completeness and also to address any questions that there might be out there about obsolete terminology viewers might have having heard these terms. Transvestism and transvestites are completely unrelated. Vest comes from the Latin verb vestire, to dress. That cross-dressing is a fetish, and it's almost always straight men who become sexually aroused by wearing women's clothing. It has nothing to do with transgender people who may have engaged in cross-dressing as children and who now dress according to their gender identity. Transgender cross-dressing has nothing to do with sexual arousal, and in fact, it's not really cross-dressing in the context of a person's authentic gender identity. This is important. Gender is assigned. It's assigned at birth before the baby leaves the hospital, and it's accepted and actually insisted upon by society at large. Little girls are dressed stereotypically and treated like little girls, and little boys likewise. The terms of this gender are natal gender, gender assigned at birth, birth assigned gender, or simply assigned gender. That's what we mean when we say assigned gender. And this gender typically correlates with a person's subjectively experienced gender or gender identity. But assigned gender and gender identity are not always the same thing. And sometimes, infrequently, but sometimes they don't correlate. And that gives rise to gender dysphoria. Sometimes, because not all trans and non-binary people are dysphoric. Not all of them are diagnosable. And I'll clarify that in a minute. Just hang with me, stick with me. The incongruence usually causes some difficulties, or at least requires some medical intervention. But again, dysphoria itself, in the strictest sense of the word, is not always present. Criterion B of the diagnostic criteria says that you either have to have subjective distress or functional impairment. You have to have one or the other. So you could meet the A diagnostic criteria and then satisfy criterion B, not because you're subjectively distressed, not because you're dysphoric, but because there's functional impairment, which can include social. Sex is biological and determined by the chromosomes. Gender is a societal construct. one that in recent years has undergone some major updates. We now recognize non-binary individuals as well as individuals who prefer to refer to themselves as gender diverse, gender fluid, gender neutral. There are a lot of terms here. Gender non-conforming, that one sounds a little defiant. Gender variant, gender atypical, etc. This reminds me of formerly gay or bisexual people who, unhappy with those labels, now prefer the term queer. I'll be honest, as a gay person myself, I struggle to grasp the difference. At the end of the day, we're talking labels, right? I mean, who cares? Why label people at all? Maybe these new labels are a reaction to that, an attempt to avoid being labeled. Maybe in another 10 or 20 years, people will discard queer and they'll have something new because they don't want to be labeled. I remember when queer it was like calling somebody a fag. It was mean-spirited, it was cruel. And so maybe that's a reason why I'm not totally comfortable with queer. It's like black people reclaiming the N-word. I think it's a little confusing even to me, and I'm a gay guy. But gender diverse appears to be the winner, the preferred term. But again, who cares? I'll call somebody whatever they want to be called. And, it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask about someone's pronouns. If you get it wrong and you're corrected, the most appropriate response is to politely apologize and get on with it using the right pronouns and the right terms. Gender diverse individuals check the other box on legal forms, but the fact that there now is an other box is progress. Those forms now acknowledge that these people exist, even though we've been pathologizing them for decades. But at birth, it's usually more simple than that. It's a boy or it's a girl, exclamation point, except for those rare cases of disordered prenatal sexual development. The DSM-5 defines gender as, quote, the public, sociocultural, and usually legally recognized lived role as boy or girl, man or woman, or other gender. Again, a new definition that acknowledges other genders. For transgendered people, natal gender, i.e. assigned, stands in contrast to their experienced gender, their true gender identity. And so now we speak of gender-affirming treatments, affirming as opposed to reassignment. Medical procedures like hormone therapy or surgeries that, quote, aim to align an individual's physical characteristics with their experienced gender. That's according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Although, we still tend to refer to gender reassignment surgery. So the terminology can be really difficult trying to navigate it all. But technically, we are reassigning gender because the wrong gender was assigned at birth, because all gender is assigned. But that may be muddying the waters. I think the easiest thing you have the assigned gender, and then you have a person's gender identity. The gender identity is authentic, the assigned gender is just assigned, and it's assigned at birth, and it can be misassigned. They don't always correlate. We say that treatments are gender affirming rather than reassigning to recognize that we're treating the incongruence and respecting that internal sense of gender, giving it priority over society's assignment based on natal sex. Again, the important thing to remember is that gender is a socio-cultural construct. The appearance and expected behaviors of the sexes and how we treat and refer to them as a result. Because biologically, there's a dichotomy, and most people fit comfortably into that dichotomy. But a significant minority are assigned incorrectly based on their natal sex, just as an even larger minority are expected to be attracted to and want to couple with and perhaps marry the opposite gender, when in fact, that expectation is misguided. So we can get it wrong at birth, And this isn't because the baby is immoral or wicked or mentally ill. In both the case of transgenderism and homosexuality, it's because true gender, like sexual orientation, isn't always obvious at birth. Why would it be? It hasn't developed yet. It's latent. And we're extrapolating. And usually we extrapolate correctly, but sometimes we get it wrong. All right, let's get on with the diagnostic criteria. All quotes are from the DSM. Gender dysphoria, as a general descriptive term, refers to the distress that may accompany the incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and one's assigned gender. Note the word may. This is a preferred term over the prior term in the DSM-4, gender identity disorder, because it focuses on the dysphoria as the clinical problem and not identity per se, end quote. Also, importantly, the distress that may or may not be present doesn't refer to the distress related to stigma, a distinct, although possibly co-occurring source of distress. One of the exclusionary criteria, it's not a formal criterion actually, but it is mentioned in the discussion section. The dysphoria must be entirely independent of societal pressure. It's not the distress caused in reaction to societal condemnation. This is a person who is distressed by the incongruence itself, not by oppression. When I was a kid, I experienced plenty of homosexual dysphoria, but what I experienced, which I had to defend against with denial and other defense mechanisms, and which included bargaining with God, just like you see in the stages of death and dying, the stages of grief. I guess I was grieving my lost heterosexuality because I thought I was supposed to be straight. Society had brainwashed me. Otherwise, why else would I be begging God, please, God, make me normal. Please take this away. I remember begging, please don't let my family find out. That dysphoria, though, was in direct response to the homophobia of the times. Young gay people are only dysphoric being gay when other people menace them for it. Remove that malice and the dysphoria disappears, and suddenly we're no longer mentally ill. That's why the APA removed it. Sure, we get depressed and anxious and everything else, but not because we're gay. Unless society is tormenting us, but the DSM is specifically rejecting subjective distress due to stigma. In that situation, it's not the homosexuality that makes us sick, it's oppression and discrimination that makes us sick. So the more appropriate diagnosis would be maybe an adjustment disorder with depression. There was a selection bias in the 1950s and 60s. Only miserable gay people went to see psychiatrists. So naturally they thought we were all depressed and self-loathing and suicidal. There was a selection bias. It only looked like we couldn't form healthy relationships because we weren't allowed to be open with those relationships. They did exist, but they were all closeted. And they probably were in the minority, certainly compared to today. And there probably were more men that might be married, that would have to seek sexual outlets in quasi-public places with strangers, furtively. And so that's all psychiatrists heard about. But that's why we can't call transgenderism a condition if it's just society's fault. The subjective distress must be due to the problem of physically not matching one's experienced gender, not bigotry, not stigma. Although both are usually evident, even today. And I'll get into Criterion B in a little bit, explain that a little bit better. So why did we remove homosexuality, but transgenderism is still in the DSM? Well, no gay child is dysphoric subjectively without having been brainwashed. And gay people can simply be free to love whomever they love without medical treatment. Whereas transgendered and non-binary individuals have to contend with this incongruence between their bodies and their gender identity. They can't just decide to be the opposite gender without some form of medical intervention. There are a subset that do, but most transgender individuals, they want hormone therapy and maybe surgery and other procedures. So before those gender-affirming treatments, they generally look like the opposite gender, or for non-binary individuals, either gender, typically the one that correlates with their natal sex. And so there's confusion. Society is addressing them and treating them as the wrong gender. When they look in the mirror, they're unhappy. And so some trans individuals truly are dysphoric about their bodies, as we'll see, but not all of them. Like all disorders in the DSM, including personality disorders and substance use disorders, there has to be functional impairment and/or subjective distress to qualify as a mental condition. So even if you meet sufficient criteria in the A section, Criterion B says, despite all of that, you either have to have subjective distress not due to stigma or some sort of functional impairment in social, academic, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. It's got to be causing you problems. And the confusing part comes in where you can't, if you're subjectively distressed, we're talking about because of the incongruence, because maybe you're unhappy with your anatomy, for example, and it has nothing to do with society. So that meets criteria. Or you have problems, which can include social problems. And so there, societal pressure can be part of what is helping to satisfy Criterion B. So I hope that's clear. At the end of the day, why label people? Why say, okay, this is a condition, transgenderism, and some people are dysphoric, and some people are not, and some people have problems, functional impairment, and some people don't. Why even go there? It's because although gender dysphoria doesn't apply to all trans and gender diverse people, even if a trans person is not dysphoric, insurance companies still require diagnostic codes before they'll pay for medicines, procedures, and surgeries. And so this diagnostic category is useful in helping to provide those services that many gender divergent individuals need and elect. And so I think that's valid. It's meant to serve this population, not pathologize it. There has to be a medical condition, there has to be a problem before we can diagnose anything and before third-party payers will pay for medical interventions. But so the problem is the incongruence and subjective distress caused by that, or functional impairment, behavioral problems, for example, in children and adolescents, or social or academic or occupational problems in older individuals. F64.2, gender dysphoria in children. By the way, gender dysphoria manifests differently in different age groups, and so we have two sets of diagnostic criteria, one for children and one for adolescents and adults. A marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration, there's always a duration criterion, as manifested by at least 6 of the following. That's 6 out of the following 8 criteria, 75%, a whopping 75%, compared to around 55% for most other disorders, and 33% for the diagnostic criteria for trans adolescents and adults. So we're way more stringent with children. And one of those diagnostic criteria must be criterion A1, a strong desire to be of the other gender, or an insistence that one is the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. There's always that disclaimer to allow for non-binary individuals and gender diverse, gender fluid individuals. Importantly, the DSM allows that, quote, the following examples may be less prominent in children raised in surroundings with fewer gender stereotypes. So here again, we see the societal influence, because gender is a societal construct. even when we're not talking about the distress that an individual may feel because physically they're not the right gender. Some of these behaviors that we see in children are less problematic in cultures with less gender stereotypes. And as society continues to evolve, it'll be interesting over the decades to see how some of this changes. Prepubertal individuals assigned one gender at birth may express a marked, persistent feeling or conviction that they're the opposite gender. So little children will say this at a very young age. If you hear a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old who isn't aware of what's going on in the culture and is not on social media yet, say, for example, and so really hasn't heard of transsexualism and playmates are not talking about being transgendered, then it's actually quite rare, but that is very, very important. If right out of the cradle they are saying, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, or vice versa, or they express aversion to the idea of being a boy or a girl, or they assert that they'll grow up to be a woman or a man, respectively. Number 2, in boys assigned gender, a strong preference for cross-dressing or simulating female attire, or in girls, again assigned gender, a strong preference for wearing only typical masculine clothing and a strong resistance to the wearing of typical feminine clothing, i.e. cross-dressing. Individuals assigned female at birth often prefer boys' clothing and hairstyles, and they may be perceived by strangers as being boys. A lot of times they're tomboys, they're frequently mistaken for boys, and they may ask to be called by a boy's name. Sometimes they display intense negative reactions to parental attempts to have them wear dresses or other feminine attire. And some may actually refuse to attend school or social events where such clothing is required. Dressing in male clothing has always been more acceptable. It's always okay for tomboys to wear pants and short hair, but it's a major taboo for a little boy to wear a dress and sport a feminine hairstyle. And this is an aside, but if you ask my opinion as to the reason, I link that with misogyny. I won't get into that. Gender dysphoric individuals assigned male at birth who meet this criterion and who prefer dressing in girls' or women's clothing may improvise clothing from available materials. Since parents are less likely to provide skirts and dresses, they might use towels, aprons, or scarves, etc. to simulate long hair or as skirts. Number 3, a strong preference for cross-gender roles in make-believe play or fantasy play. For example, boys pretending to be the wife or the mother. Number 4, a strong preference for the toys, games, or activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. Note, here again, the term stereotypically, once again imposed by the expectations of the culture. Stereotypes are developed based on what we usually see, and they're only important in that we use them to rationalize our bigotry, discrimination. Children of either assigned gender may demonstrate marked gender nonconformity in role-playing, gender-typed play, and toy preferences, styles, mannerisms, fantasies, and peer preferences. A quick note, just for the sake of brevity and clarity here, when I say girls or boys, like the DSM, I'm referring to natal sex, assigned gender at birth. It's for simplicity's sake, it's not to invalidate a given individual's gender identity. But I'm going to be talking about both trans and cisgendered boys and girls. So for clarity, I'm referring to natal sex and assigned gender identity at birth when I simply say boys and girls. Girls may prefer contact sports, rough and tumble play, traditional boyhood games, and boys as playmates are most often preferred. They show little interest in stereotypically feminine toys such as dolls or feminine activities like dressing up or role-playing. And the opposite is true for boys. who may role-play female figures, like the mom, and may be, quote, intensely interested in female fantasy figures, close quotes. I'm not sure what the DSM exactly means by this. Are we talking about Wonder Woman or just female figures that are in real life that the boys look up to? It's not clear. To me, anyway. Traditional feminine activities, stereotypical games and pastimes like playing house, tea parties, hopscotch, makeup, and quote-unquote drawing feminine pictures. Here again, I don't really know what feminine pictures. I mean, unicorns and rainbows, maybe butterflies, I don't know. And also watching television or videos of favorite female characters. And here's where you may see maybe, Wonder Woman. Number 5, a strong preference for playmates of the other gender. We all know that children of a young age tend to naturally congregate with members of their own gender, and not just because they're interested in the same games. Before they decide what they're going to play, little boys seem to feel more comfortable with little boys and little girls as well, except for a lot of gay children, you'll see, and trans children. Some of these behaviors, some of these criteria you do see in homosexuality. Number 6, in boys, assigned gender, a strong rejection of typically masculine toys, games, and activities, and a strong avoidance of rough and tumble play. Or in girls, assigned gender, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games, and activities. So criteria number 4 is a preference for, and number 6 is a quote-unquote strong rejection of. And one or both or neither may be present and still satisfy the 6 out of 8 criteria. So again, in boys, for example, stereotypical female type dolls like Barbie may be favorite toys, and girls their preferred playmates. They avoid rough and tumble play, and they have little interest in stereotypically masculine toys like cars and trucks. This doesn't mean that all boys who play Barbie turn out to be transgender. Notice I didn't say grow up to be. They're already transgender. But not all boys who play with dolls are. I would say the vast majority are gay, however. Just saying. Number 7, a strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy. This is a common but not universal feature. And number 8, a strong desire for the primary and or secondary sex characteristics that match one's experienced gender. Again, with regard to 7 and 8, one or the other, both or neither may be present in children, in prepubertal children. And we can still satisfy the 6 out of 8 criteria that's required to make this diagnosis. Boys may state that they find their penis or testes disgusting, that they wish to have them removed, or that they have or wish to have a vagina. And some girls may express a desire to have a penis or claim that they have a penis or that they'll grow one when they're older. Occasionally, they refuse to urinate in a sitting position. That behavior has been seen. Criterion B, the condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, school, or other important areas of functioning. Like all mental conditions, it has to lead to subjective distress or functional impairment. Clinically significant means that it's severe enough to require treatment, medical or psychological intervention. It requires medical attention. So the problem is not that they're transgender, but that being transgender is causing other social, behavioral, and or academic problems, or they're distressed by the physical incongruence. And then you're supposed to specify if this transgenderism is occurring with a disorder of sexual development. And a more PC term that's included in the DSM is a difference of sex development, which, I don't know, it might be taking political correctness to an extreme, but examples are really rare esoteric conditions that the laity would not be familiar with, like congenital adrenal hyperplasia or androgen insensitivity syndrome. Androgen insensitivity syndrome is really fascinating, but it's tangents beyond the scope of this video. F64.0, gender dysphoria in adolescents and adults. Criterion A marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration, as manifested by at least 2 of the following. 2 out of the following 6, 33%. Number 1, a marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and primary or secondary sex characteristics, or in young adolescents, the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. Number 2, a strong desire to be rid of one's primary and or secondary sex characteristics because of a marked incongruence with one's experienced expressed gender, or again, in young adolescents, a desire to prevent the development of the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. Girls may state that they don't want to develop breasts or begin menstruating, and when physical signs of puberty develop, individuals assigned male at birth may shave their facial, body, and leg hair at the first sign of growth. They sometimes go as far as to bind their genitals to make erections less visible, whereas individuals assigned female at birth may bind their breasts, walk with a stoop, or use loose sweaters to make their breasts less visible. Older adolescents, when sexually active, often don't show or allow their partners to touch their sexual organs. And for adults, with an aversion toward their genitals, sexual activity is constrained by the preference that their genitals not be seen or touched by their partners. This doesn't occur in all individuals, but it has been seen and frequently reported. Number 3, a strong desire for the primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender. Number 4, a strong desire to be of the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. So it doesn't always have to do with sex characteristics. It's not always to do with, my anatomy doesn't match who I feel like I am on the inside. That's not always present, and that may be a misconception out there. Remember, we only need 2 out of these 6. Number 5, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. What do we mean by treated here? Well, we might mean being addressed by the right pronouns, being welcomed in segregated public restrooms according to one's subjectively experienced gender, etc. But there are other ways of being treated differentially, which as a society we sanction, like having doors held open, that one might argue are courtesies that should be extended to all individuals. Whoever reaches the door first. If I reach a door first, I'll hold it open for whoever is behind me, whether it's a man or a woman. So it's nice that we do that for women, but why not do it for everybody? Why not be polite for everybody? Or ordering at a restaurant. Maybe that could be an order of proximity to the waiter and not preferentially starting with the women. I don't want to sound like an asshole. It's nice, but when you examine it carefully, folks, it's a double standard. And think about it. In the past, men would just order for women. Is that acceptable? We did away with that. Women aren't so dependent and deferential that they rely on their male companions to tell them what to eat. If we want equality, true equality, in my mind, that means no deferential treatment. Be polite to everyone. Be kind and considerate and deferential to everyone. You first. No, you first. No, you first. Right? I think if women and minorities and people who are marginalized and mistreated and they're fighting for equality, then they can't expect to be on equal footing over here but have these special privileges that make them different, that make them they're being treated differently. I think that's a double standard. Anyway, number 6, a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. I think that could be said to be actually true for gay people. If you look at it, and again, maybe that's playing to a stereotype, but I think it's true in the vast majority of gay people. B, the condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Here we substitute the word occupational for school. And you specify if this is with a disorder or a difference of sex development when that is present. Increasingly, adolescents request or may obtain without medical prescription and supervision drugs that suppress production of gonadal steroids or that block gonadal hormone actions. Clinically referred adolescents often want hormone treatment and may also wish for gender-affirming surgery. In adulthood, those not previously treated may seek hormone treatment, again sometimes without a prescription, and gender-affirming surgery, while other adults are satisfied with either hormone treatment or surgery alone, or without any gender-affirming medical treatment whatsoever. There is a subset that doesn't seek treatment whatsoever. And if those individuals are not dysphoric and they're not seeking treatment, so they don't need a third-party payer, and there's no dysfunction at work, and there's even no dysfunction socially, because they tell the transphobes to just go fuck themselves, then you don't diagnose those people. They're transgender, but they don't have gender dysphoria. There's nothing wrong. And that's how we can justify still having this category in the DSM, where we did away with homosexuality. Because the only thing you have to fix if you're gay and you hate yourself for being gay because you've been brainwashed by society, you have this internalized homophobia, is to go fix the homophobia. You can go talk to a therapist about it, but the problem isn't that you're gay. The problem is that you've been brainwashed. And then there's also voice training for trans women. So there are various modes of treatment. Of course, cost and other considerations certainly also come into play. It's worth mentioning that those living in an accepting environment may openly express the desire to be and to be treated as their experienced gender and dress partly or completely as their experienced gender, along with a typical hairstyle, from a young age, and even adopt a new first name. I have a young trans woman, a 19-year-old patient, who has had no treatments and who appears fully to be her natal gender, the assigned, i.e. wrong gender. And I refer to her by her chosen name, not her legal name. I don't use Ms. because she's so young. I refer to my very young patients by their first names. I don't use titles with teenagers. But I don't use her legal name. Now on the prescription pad, I have to use her legal name and in the chart, but I don't call her that. Even though, to look at her, she looks like a young man, and voice training hasn't started yet, so she sounds like a young man. Once identified, you see what I just did? You see what I just did? I'm going to leave that in. I'm going to leave that in because in a moment I'm going to talk about transphobia, or rather just that might be a strong word, but a kind of a bigotry that is in us that we don't even know is in us. For adolescents and adults, you specify if they are post-transition. By post-transition, we mean that the individual has transitioned to full-time living in the experienced gender, with or without legalization of their gender change. That's irrelevant. And additionally, has undergone or is preparing to undergo at least one gender-affirming medical procedure or treatment regimen, such as regular gender-affirming hormone treatments or gender reassignment surgery confirming the experienced gender, such as breast augmentation surgery and or vulvovaginoplasty in an individual assigned male at birth, or transmasculine chest surgery and or phalloplasty in an individual assigned female at birth. There's a related topic here about children and adolescents that identify as trans that's controversial, and it's actually beyond the scope of this video. Whether we should treat prepubertal children with hormones to prevent those secondary sexual characteristics from forming. And the concern is that maybe those children are not actually trans, maybe they're just gay, and they're going to grow up and they turn out to be gay, but because of this huge public awareness that's going on currently, and everybody's talking about it, and everybody's heard of it, And that's a good thing because we need that in order to fight discrimination against transgendered individuals and to get them the services that they need. You might have a gay child who gets confused by that. And there are gay adults who have had treatment, including some surgical treatments, physical treatments, who have regretted. So I'm just going to say that I do believe that we should proceed cautiously. And that's why you have to meet so many more criteria as a child as opposed to an adult or an adolescent. But I do think that we need to be careful there. I think that we should just take it on a case-by-case basis, that we shouldn't say, no child, no prepubertal child. We shouldn't block puberty in any child. I think that's an extreme view. If you have a child who from a very early age was saying all these things and met all this criteria, and it's unequivocal to at least two practitioners, a psychiatrist and another practitioner, a doctor or a psychologist, and we've talked to the parents, and it's obvious that this individual is transgendered, then I think it's absolutely, we would want to do all we can to help them transition in the most successful way as an adult. But anyway, associated features. There is, very curiously, an overrepresentation of autism spectrum traits, and that's been observed in all age groups. Conversely, individuals with autism spectrum disorder are more likely to exhibit gender diversity. Adolescents and adults with gender dysphoria before gender-affirming treatment and legal gender change are understandably at an increased risk for mental health problems, including suicidal ideations, attempts, and completed suicides. After gender reassignment, the adjustment varies, but elevated suicide risks and mental health problems may persist, unfortunately. And it's not clear to what extent that's due to society. But in prepubertal children, increasing age is associated with having more behavioral or emotional problems, but that is directly related to the increasing non-acceptance of gender non-conforming behavior by others. And this is according to the DSM. Note here, we're talking about behaviors and emotional problems like anxiety or depression, not the gender dysphoria itself, right? Again, not the subjective distress of having been assigned the wrong gender at birth. That's experienced independently of societal pressures. This is the other arm of Criterion B. That subjective distress is not an absolute requirement. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I just want to make it very clear that you could not have that, but you could have it's and or impairment in functioning. So we offer individuals treatment and services, whether they have dysphoria or not. We can diagnose gender dysphoria if they meet the criteria and they're having problems adjusting socially or academically or occupationally in the absence of dysphoria. And then there are transgendered individuals who are not dysphoric, who are well-adjusted, and who, thank you very much, can pay for their own treatments or don't want treatments. Okay, so I hope I've described the spectrum of individuals from cisgendered individuals to transgendered individuals or non-binary individuals. Non-binary individuals are completely off the spectrum, but who have all these various different manifestations of gender dysphoria. In any case, children and adolescents who feel supported and accepted in their gender nonconformity obviously show less or even no psychological problems beyond the gender dysphoria itself, if they have that. Prevalence. There are no large-scale population studies of gender dysphoria. Based on gender-affirming treatment-seeking populations, the prevalence for gender dysphoria diagnosis across populations has been assessed to be less than 1 in 1,000, less than 0.1% for both sets of individuals. But these prevalence rates are likely underestimates because many adults with gender dysphoria don't seek care at specialty treatment centers, and also because self-reporting surveys in the US and Europe suggest higher numbers, as high as 2%. Monozygotic twins do not have a 100% concordance rate. So it's not 100% genetic. When you're looking at the nurture seems to be important, but the concordance rate is much greater. The concordance rates are much greater than for dizygotic twins. There's still a lot of stigma. There's minority stress, discrimination. These individuals tend to live on the margins of society, even with all the progress that we've made. There's violence, poor living conditions. A lot of them get kicked out of their homes at a very young age. Poverty and a shortened lifespan. Epidemiologists have determined this, as well as the fact that the prevalence of HIV is 49 times greater than in the cisgender population in one study. And there's a high rate of depression and anxiety. Suicide is a huge concern, as high as 40% or even higher. So those are the diagnostic criteria. That's the DSM. But I also want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about transphobia and my own experience with it, and to answer the question that occurred to me recently. There's such a thing called non-binary phobia. There's transphobia and there's non-binary phobia. But are transphobia and non-binary phobia non-binary themselves? Is it as simple as yes and no, black and white, hatred or no hatred? What if, like everything else these days, it seems, intolerance is a spectrum? Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? I'm going to go back to my own experience as a gay child. As a pre-adolescent, I had experiences, as a pre-adolescent, pre-pubertal child, I had experiences where I went against the boundaries of what it meant to be a boy, long before I was aware of my sexual orientation, okay? And I didn't turn out to be trans, and that's why we have to be careful with children. But around the age of 7 or 8, maybe, I remember being teased about quote unquote playing with dolls. And the irony is, I don't even remember actually playing with them, but I remember the fallout. And even then, I remember thinking it was a rumor, because I was playing with my cousin Francis, which I did a lot. But when they were saying, "Oh, he's playing with dolls," I remember thinking, "What are you guys talking about? When?" And maybe I did play with dolls once or twice. I'm not being defensive about it. Maybe we did play with paper dolls once, or maybe one of my cousins, Francis's older brothers, walked by and said, "Oh, what are you guys doing? What are you guys playing? You're playing with dolls?" And maybe from there it spread like a rumor or whatever. But my dad heard about it. My brothers heard about it. Whether I did or didn't, it doesn't matter. They heard about it, and then the next thing I know, I don't know if my dad said it, probably my dad said it, that if I played with dolls, my balls would fall off. My dad actually said that. And so what I remember is my Uncle Santos, who is Francis's dad. I remember him coming home from work one day, and I was so little, I was looking up at him, and he said, he was teasing me, but I was so little that he was looking down at me. So, I was 6, I was little. And he said, "Oh, are you playing with dolls? Oh, you're playing with dolls. Did they tell you that your balls are going to fall off? Is that what they told you?" And he even did this. And I remember my aunt said, "Déjalo, Santos," in Spanish. And I just was looking up at him. I don't know what to say. I was thinking, when did I play with dolls? But what do you say? What do you say to your uncle who's telling you your balls are going to fall off? That's what your dad said. So, and then shortly thereafter, my dad bought me this set with cars and trucks. My dad, okay, it wasn't Christmas, it wasn't my birthday. My dad wasn't a mushy, sentimental dad who, brought you presents all the time. And, I have to smile at the ignorance. How silly that my dad thought, well, this is going to be, this will fix him. So what if I was playing with dolls? So what? I turned out to be gay anyway. It didn't matter. Those little Tonka trucks didn't save me from being gay. And you know what I did with those trucks? I went and put them in a drawer. But that has to do with my OCD. And I did another video on that. I'm not going to go into that right now. Another example. When I was in the 6th grade, preparing to transfer to middle school, we had to select our electives. And from the list, I selected typing and tap dancing because I always wanted to know how to type. And tap dancing seemed like a cool thing. I've seen a lot of tap dancers, and I wanted to be able to do that. When I told my teacher what I had selected, she didn't say a word, but the look on her face, a look came over her face that said, "Oh my God, that is so inappropriate." And I saw it, and I knew what it meant. She didn't have to say anything. She was telling me that I had selected inappropriately. And of course, I put two together in my mind, and I thought, oh, because it's only for girls. And I capitulated to that face, and I changed one of my electives. I kept typing because I wanted to know how to type. And you know what? Today, I can type over 150 words a minute. Everybody types, not because with computers, but I do it the right way, and I type like the wind, entire phrases, without even thinking. But I can't tap dance today. Who knows what a great tap dancer I could have been, And how was I to know that tap dance, the tap dance was 100% girls in the tap dance class. But that reminds me of the fact that a straight boy accidentally got placed in that class. So it was one straight boy and all these girls, and he loved it. He loved it. And he went to dance class every day. He was surrounded by girls. So there might have been at least one other boy, but anyway, there again, society's stereotypes and their expectations, I came up against it. But so how can I be transphobic, right? Having experienced that and also gone through my own torment, being a gay guy, no way, right? But what if transphobia is non-binary itself? Maybe it's not as simple as hating and non-hating. I don't consider myself to be a bigot, and yet I'm going to admit, initially, trans people made me uncomfortable. No. I was uncomfortable around trans people. What was that about? However one spins it, even though there was no malice, that discomfort was by definition an aversion. Remember xenophobia? And while there was no malice, no wish to deny anyone the right to be who they are and to be comfortable and happy being who they are and being free to express that, nor any wish to deny them any of the rights everyone else enjoys, still, what was that discomfort about? It's not surprising that it took being around trans people, and today there are more openly trans and non-binary individuals to be around. To get that aversion to improve, you have to be exposed to, and you have to interact with, and you have to see that it's no big deal. But I knew that I was grappling with something. I knew that, I guess I was kind of in denial of that I was being an asshole, when it came to feeling uncomfortable. Why did I feel uncomfortable? And I knew a large part of it was that with trans women, I could tell, right? The square jaw, the Adam's apple, the big hands, and yet they had makeup on and a feminine hairstyle, and they were wearing a dress, and I was uncomfortable. I didn't want them to know that I could tell. And so I was trying to be normal. And in trying to act normal, well, you're acting abnormally. And so I wasn't comfortable. And I just thought I couldn't make eye contact. And I thought just act natural. And I had good intentions. I was trying to be polite, but it did come from a place where, that's different. That's different. I don't know how to react to a man in a dress, which is how I saw it. I didn't see it as a trans woman. So the point I'm getting to is that, so I had that, but I kind of ignored it. And I thought to myself, I'm not a bigot. I'm not a hater. I'm not transphobic, right? And then fast forward, a trans woman that I had known for months, and she came out to me one day. "I'm trans," she said simply. And I was floored. I had no idea. And when she revealed her transgender status to me, I was really surprised, and I wasn't uncomfortable in the moment, and I was able to, tell her that she was gorgeous and all of that. And she showed me pictures of when she was a boy, and she was cute as a boy too. But my concept of her changed, and that's where the problem lay. Okay, that's where the germ of transphobia lay here. I wasn't uncomfortable with her because I couldn't tell, and now she was just coming out to me, and so that discomfort, I bypassed it. But now I saw her differently, and I obsessed about that for a couple of hours thereafter before coming to the conclusion that I was a fool, and once again I was being an asshole to, for 1 minute, think of her any differently. But to my credit, what I was obsessing about was not her transgender status, okay? It was about my reaction, about the fact that I was seeing her differently. It's like finding out somebody's Jewish or gay or a Trump supporter, and suddenly seeing them as fundamentally different when nothing has changed. Nothing about our many, many hours of interaction had changed. I didn't like her any less. I didn't think she was any less pretty. I just suddenly thought of her as distinct from other women. And listen, I'm not talking about her anatomy. Her anatomy is none of my business. We're all different when it comes to our junk, okay? I saw her differently as a person. And it took me a couple of hours to come to my senses. I'm happy to report that I did. But what was that, if not a tinge of prejudice? I didn't know it was in me. I was surprised. That's what I was distressed about. That's what I obsessed about. That's what shocked me. Not her, me, my reaction. And so I've come to the conclusion that transphobia, like any bigotry, like any prejudice, maybe a better word for it, is non-binary. There was no anger, there was no hatred, it wasn't pernicious, it wasn't ugly, but it was primitive of me. It was unenlightened. Maybe I'm xenophobic diverse. I'll give you another example that doesn't have anything to do with transphobia, but that's a good example, so I really want to give it. I was assaulted one time by this guy. He was a huge guy. He was way taller than me, and he was morbidly obese. He was enormous, okay? And that's relevant because he shoved me to the ground, and I'm 5'3", and I weigh 107 pounds, and so I fell to the ground. And when I was telling my sister the story of this assault, I described him as this big, huge, fat, black guy. The fat was relevant. The black was not. And she called me out on it. She said, I want to point out to you, you described him as a big, fat, black guy. Why black? And initially, because it was so automatic, and I'm not a racist, I don't have anything against black people, I said, well, no, I was just describing him to you. But had he been white, I would not have said this big, fat, white guy, right? And so what was I doing categorizing? And then I will admit something even further. And this is what is really deep in the recesses of my mind. I didn't know it was there. The being black was part of his villainy in somebody who is not a racist. Or am I? And I think that germ probably was planted a long time ago. Here's where the nurture comes into play. My dad was very hostile, very open about it. So, you pick up on that kind of stuff. And finally, you really do have to be around other people. I met a plastic surgeon once, and I was married at the time to my late husband. Not legally, because it wasn't an option. But nonetheless, we had been together for years, and he was my husband. And as I was talking about our relationship, he suddenly he interrupted me and he said, well, now you're making me change my mind about gay marriage. Apparently he was a conservative, and apparently he had been against it. But just in talking with me, and we had just met, I was introducing myself as a colleague in the neighborhood, and I wasn't making a speech about gay rights. I was just talking simply and modestly about my marriage. He saw that I was a good person. He saw that I was talking about somebody that I loved, that I cared about. And in an instant, to his credit, he saw how ugly and pernicious being against gay marriage was. And he felt guilty, appropriately, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to not blurt out right there on the spot, well, now I feel bad. Now I recognize that I'm wrong in saying that they shouldn't have the right to get married, whatever his exact position on that was. And my point is that it takes interacting with our trans brothers and sisters to get over that discomfort and to get over whatever seeds of transphobia you may have. You have to know people to recognize their humanity. It can't be an abstract concept that you've stored in the cloud. It has to be downloaded. And the same was true for gay people. Before you saw gay people on television and in the movies that weren't being demonized, they just happened to be gay. Before you found out that your friend or your friend's son or your own cousin or your uncle, friends and family, before you saw gay people, before gay people could start to come out, you couldn't attach homosexuality to actual people whom you knew were decent and good and whom maybe you loved even. And so it takes that. And so that's why it's a good thing that being transgender there's so much public awareness of it right now. So thank you for joining me for this talk on gender diversity and gender dysphoria. I hope I clarified a few things. I hope you learned a few things, and comments are always welcome.